This is The Cluttered Path, stories about life and the human experience. Imagine two different jobs you've started. The first job represents your best first day at work, and the second represents your worst first day at work. Your best first day, company number one. Somebody's there to meet you on your first day. There's friendly and efficient boarding process to get you started. You get a mentor assigned. They give you an intro to the organization. They're taking you around, introducing you to people. The mission and culture are explained. Expectations of you are established. Your training schedule for new employee onboarding is laid out for you. And then you start looking around. The people, they've got a positive energy. The culture, it just gives off this buzz. There's a personality with the place. People are happy and focused. You feel excited and eager to be part of the team, and you're ready to get started. Now, switch over to company number two. That represents your worst first day at work. You show up and nobody was expecting you. By the way, I've seen this happen in companies. Nobody was expecting you. They're scrambling to find someone just to help you. There's no onboarding process. They just park you someplace and say, wait here. They're scrambling to figure out what to do with you, and you feel like a burden on the team. You feel like you're just out of place. You look around and you notice the people are unhappy. You can feel that it's like a toxic culture. The people are tense. They're stressed. The morale is in the tank. There's no team. They're just individuals operating alone. And you immediately feel tension and stress in the air. So the difference between that good and bad company, what is it? It's leadership. There's an old military adage that says there are no bad units, only bad officers. So it all comes down to leadership.
I've had both those experiences in my career.
I think we all have. And it's a very stark contrast. And you want to say, hey, there's a spectrum, and most companies fall within the middle of the spectrum. And that's kind of true, but I've seen the best and the worst personally. So our topic for today is the impact of leadership. We just finished a series of episodes on Genghis Khan, and there was this common refrain that kept coming back to us, and that was his influence over people. And you can just boil that down to his leadership. So here are the main topics we're going to cover today. We're going to start with the ripple effect of leadership. Then we're going to go into the negative impact of bad leadership. And then we're going to talk about some of the positive impacts of good leadership. And then we're going to circle back to Genghis Khan and just talk about the character of his leadership. But what are we talking about when we say leadership? We're not restricting the conversation to people in leadership roles. You're a manager or you're a director. We're talking about everyone. Everyone can be a leader, good or bad. When we're talking about leadership in group dynamics, this is in your job, sports, or maybe even a social setting. When we're talking group dynamics and leadership, we're talking about your influence with other people, regardless of your position in the organization or any title you've been granted. I would put forth here that not all people with the title of manager are necessarily good leaders. So that's group dynamics. And then as an individual, just forgetting other people, as an individual, do you have the ability to conduct your own affairs in life? Are you proactive? Do you take responsibility and work toward positive outcomes for yourself? Or are you passive? Do you sit back and just watch how life unfolds for you and just wait for things to happen? Now, if you are a leader of a team, your leadership is likely to have a direct impact on the success or failure of the organization. Now, there's an exception here when there are strong leaders throughout the team who carry the team despite its bad leader. So we got plenty of stories to share, and I would encourage you to please send us your good and bad, or maybe even your funny stories about leadership.
Please do. Looking forward to hear other people's experiences. It's one of the things we all share is our experiences and how they shape our view of our jobs or ourselves. And it's good to share those. So everybody wants to know they're not alone.
Yes. Yeah. And that's our goal here, is to just have that conversation so our listeners can see, hey, you're not crazy. And maybe encourage people to work on themselves. If you want to share your stories, you can email us at feedback@clutteredpath.com, Or we've also got information associated with the podcast here for how you can get in touch with us. You can text us, all sorts of ways to communicate with us. But please send us your feedback. All right, let's jump into the ripple effect of leadership. Now, I was reading an article talking about chaos theory and the butterfly effect. It's a fantastical idea about a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa, which leads to a hurricane striking the U.S. 3 weeks later. So that's the butterfly effect. But the idea behind that is small variations in the initial conditions set the stage for drastically different outcomes. That's chaos theory and the butterfly effect in a nutshell. Now, sometimes these small things at the outset, they can lead to catastrophe. And one example of that would be the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. I don't know if you remember that, but you can Google it. It was a pretty tense time in the entire world because a nuclear reactor was essentially melting down. After this whole disaster was over, they realized that the failure was caused by just a tiny little safety valve. So one little small thing led to a nuclear catastrophe. But then small things can also lead to very positive impacts or outcomes. In researching for our topic today, I found out there's a website called Medium where people just write essays and they share their ideas and thoughts. And there was a writer on Medium who had written a lot of essays, and there was a homeless guy who read these essays and they impacted him personally and changed his life, turned his life around. So got him off the streets and got him back onto a productive path in his life. So that's one little small thing that you do that can be a very positive impact for others. And as far as our well-being goes, talking about our personal health, if we are able to adopt very small changes in our habits around sleep, exercise, nutrition, and meditation, things like that, they do have a huge positive impact over time. And then thinking about the environment, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, but there's this Bodeli depression in Chad, the country Chad. And in this depression, there are very strong winds that carry dust from this depression across the Atlantic Ocean, and it results in nutrient-rich soil in the Amazon rainforest. So that's a pretty amazing thing here. So one little small thing over a whole continent away, an ocean away, the weather conditions bring soil to the Amazon rainforest, which is pretty cool. Those are some small things that generate very positive impact.
I definitely resonate with the kind of the personal things, right? The small things that we can do to set ourselves up for longer term success.
Right.
Yeah. The dailies.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that could be the topic of a whole new podcast. I mean, it's little personal habits that we can adopt that create big change for us. We may talk about that in the future. But talking about organizations and small changes and the butterfly effect, when we're talking about teams of people, you have to understand that behaviors and attitudes permeate the team. Now, personalities for a team, they create a unique fingerprint. And just to share a story about that, when I'm talking about a fingerprint for a team, I'm talking about its personality. So back in the day, I work in the tech industry, and I was visiting a customer. It was a service provider, and a small service provider. They're not around anymore, so I'm not going to share sensitive info to embarrass anyone, but there's nothing really embarrassing about this. But I visited this customer, and I walk in their office, and they literally had a Gothic theme for their entire office. The walls were painted black. They had like skeletons sitting out on file cabinets, and the people were dressed in Gothic costumes and stuff. Like literally everybody in that office was a goth. And they were super nice people. But what had happened over time is this organization became a Gothic culture. And kudos to them. They were a good customer, and it was fun interacting with them. But they had a unique fingerprint based on the personalities of that organization. You had anything like that, James?
Not specifically. I had a lot of experiences as well, kind of being in the IT consulting field, of going into places and observing the culture of what you're walking into.
Right.
It is, immediately palpable when you walk into a place, and it's like a good feeling. Right? It's like you can just kind of walk in and know. It's like, oh, even if they've got their heads down working, you can still tell it's like they're enjoying what they're doing.
Right.
Versus you walk into a meeting room and everybody's like, oh, just everybody kind of sits down and sighs and doesn't, you can tell they don't want to be there.
Right.
In some cases, maybe because they're maybe being asked to talk to a consultant, but
yeah.
But more often than not, it's just they're beat down, and they just they don't want to be at work at all. And it's like,
yeah, I've seen that. I've had job interviews where I'm being interviewed for a position, and I'm literally talking to. This has happened multiple times throughout my career. Literally talking to a VP or a director. I'm talking to people in leadership. And you can just tell that they are just beat down and they don't want to be there. And I'm like, oh my word. If you guys are like this, there's no telling how burned out and beat down your people are. Unless I'm really desperate for a job, I'm going to say no to that. Thanks, but no thanks. This makes me think about that. My background is military before I got into the tech industry. And you would think that this idea that every unit or every team has its own little personality, it's borne out in the military because everyone looks the same. Everyone is wearing the exact same clothes in the military. But even with that, I mean, even everyone has pretty much the exact same haircuts. Even the ladies, there are regulations about how they can wear their hair.
Right.
But even with everybody looking the same, every unit in the military has its own unique identity. And you think about that every couple of years. I mean, I was a member of 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. Every couple of years, the majority of the troops transfer out to new duty stations. The leadership team is replaced, and you get all new personalities. And so what happens is the personality of the unit changes every 1 or 2 years because you got an influx of new people. And I'm thinking about, we had a scout sniper platoon. And every infantry battalion has a sniper platoon. And I'm thinking about this gentleman. I won't share his name, but he was the scout sniper platoon sergeant during my time in the battalion. And he was an absolute animal. And I mean, he rode a Harley. He was missing teeth from getting into all these bar fights and stuff like that. And he literally, I mean, his manner of speech was just, and just, he was a monster of a person, but he was a good leader. And what happened over time is his impact on that platoon, they developed their own personality. And they started taking on characteristics of that platoon sergeant because of his strong personality, the way he carried himself out, and the way he was very forceful in his leadership. Not to say it's good or bad. I'm not advocating for any one thing or over another. Just pointing out that that platoon took on the personality of that one person because of his strong personality. And so as people come and go, what happens is the team ends up coalescing around the one personality or the multiple personalities in that team that are the strongest. So that's the military. Organizations develop their own personality over time, even if everyone looks exactly the same. And so I do have to point out, though, that the team will get this fingerprint or personality through this process of attracting some and repelling others. Some people join the organization and go, this is just not for me. I'm not a good fit here. And then they leave. Others, they jump in and go, you know what? I love it here. These are my people. And I'm thinking about the customer that had their Gothic theme. They attracted goth personalities. That's not good or bad. That's who they attracted. And people that weren't necessarily into that lifestyle or whatnot, they did not choose to join the organization. And I'm thinking about, a personal story here from the military. I had a new Marine join my platoon, and he just was not a good fit. He joined the military. He was a few years older he was a lot older than most of the Marines coming to the unit. So he already had a way of living, and he'd formed his opinions, and he wasn't malleable and, like an 18-year-old. And so he shows up at our unit and he just did not fit in. He did not want to conform to standards. And over time, this guy ended up, he went down to medical and said, "Ooh, my knee hurts." And he ended up getting out of the military. Just wasn't a good fit for him. So that's what happens. People, they're not a good fit. They end up leaving. Is that what you've seen in your experience, James?
Yeah. Worst case is those that don't fit, they just decide just to stay because they don't want to go through the trouble of leaving.
Yeah. Yes. I've seen that.
Yeah. It's like, you know what? I know I don't fit here, but I don't want to go through the trouble. I can't be bothered to go somewhere else.
Right.
And some people just, they don't have that flexibility. They're like, I've got a wife, kids at home, and parent struggles and all this other stuff. And I'm like, I have to have a job, and I don't have the time or energy to go look for another job because I'm dealing with home stuff. And
right.
So they just kind of put up with it, which is unpleasant for everybody. They don't like it. And it's not necessarily a good place for the team to be either.
Right.
But we all definitely, you create a culture.
Yeah.
And many times the leader, the director, manager can have a lot of input on that.
Yeah.
Right. Because just by default, as the acknowledged leadership of the team or the unit, they can put their fingerprints kind of on things.
Yeah. What I saw in the military was that if you had a weak leader or someone that was very inexperienced, but they had the rank, and more often than not, it was usually a lieutenant just coming out of school, just out of OCS, comes to a new unit. The best thing a commander could do is sit that lieutenant down. And I saw this often. The battalion commander would bring new officers into his office and say, "Listen, you're new. Shut up and listen." The NCOs in your unit, they're experienced. They know what the heck they're doing. If you're smart, you're going to listen to them and learn. And so we did things like that to mitigate potential bad leaders, but some of it you just couldn't get around. But yeah, we try to mitigate that. And if you're leading an organization, you would do well to watch out for leaders and how they're impacting the organization and try to mitigate that. There are things you can do. But regardless, every team takes on its own unique personality, and here's why. I read an article. It's called Trickle-Down Effect of Good and Bad Leadership. It was written by Jack Zenger and Joseph Folkman in the Harvard Business Review back in 2016. In that article, they cite a study from UC San Diego talking about the contagious nature of emotions and behaviors. Now, with emotions, they spread like wildfire, fear especially. So if you've got a leader or anyone in your organization that's fearful about what's happening in the organization, and they're talking about it and they're expressing those emotions, they spread like wildfire. Positive people, on the other hand, they create a positive atmosphere. Negative people, they create a toxic atmosphere. Pretty straightforward. And I'm thinking about another military story here. A young lieutenant back in, it was during wartime. I won't share names or who it is, where it was, or what unit, or any of that stuff. But there was this young lieutenant who had just taken command of a platoon, and they were literally about to go off to war. And this young lieutenant was afraid, and he started talking about it. And he sat the whole platoon down, and because he's in this position, he's in a position of authority. He's commanding the platoon. So he sits the whole platoon down and starts telling them, "Oh my goodness, we're expecting X number of casualties, blah, 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 blah." He scared the pants off everybody. And the platoon sergeant stepped up and said, "We can't have this." So they ended up relieving that lieutenant of command, put him off in a staff position so he couldn't do that anymore. And the platoon sergeant ended up leading the platoon. But they had to mitigate that. But emotions, they spread like wildfire. And also behaviors, how you're conducting yourself, they spread like wildfire too, negative and positive. And the study from UC San Diego, it talks about the fact that if you have overweight friends, that can lead you to becoming overweight as well. On a positive note, if you quit smoking and you're talking about it and people know that you're quitting smoking, that can influence others to quit because, you're talking about the health benefits and, I feel so much better and yada, yada, yada. And that can be a positive influence. A negative influence, if you have a friend that divorces, you're 33% more likely to divorce because you're having those conversations. And then when we talk about companies and the team dynamics and behavioral contagion, so that's the concept that was talked about in the article, emotional and behavioral contagion. Sounds like a disease, but with behaviors in the companies, if your managers have behaviors that are negative, they're going to have a negative influence on the team. Positive influence. And so here's some of the behaviors that have the most influence over a team. Self-development. So if you've got respected, trusted people in the organization, whether it's a manager or just an individual contributor, if they're pursuing self-development, that's going to influence others. If they are technically proficient, if they have technical skills, that's going to motivate others to develop those skills as well. People that have integrity and honesty, as they're interacting, people see that, they take note of it, and they see the positive impacts of that, and that's going to influence their behavior as well. And also managers that are results focused, if they're looking at the outcome of certain activities that you're performing. And if you're focusing on getting results, that is going to have a huge positive influence over the team. Talking about the effect of good and bad leadership from that UC San Diego study, the interesting thing is that good bosses, they end up attracting good people. And on the flip side, bad bosses attract not so good people. So that's something to be aware of. And so there's that concept of social contagion. It means that behaviors and emotions are usually caught rather than taught. So people watch what you do rather than what you say, and you take on what you're catching from other people around you. And so for me personally, this is motivation for me to change, because I read another article that talked about how your attitude and your actions matter more than what you think. So if you've got bad habits and character flaws, they have a probability of being mimicked by others, just the same as good habits and positive character. So improving yourself, it creates a better environment for you, your family, your social network, your workplace, and pretty much anywhere you interact with humans.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that social contagion, James?
You can certainly see how working to improve yourself can affect your family as well. It can be sometimes because family brings with it a lot more emotions and things than not, or than non-family. You can actually be a little too close to see some things that you might see at work.
Right.
As your actions and attitudes affect others around you at work, your family sees them as well.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the most important place to realize you're a leader, whether you like it or not. If you're a parent, you're a leader.
Yeah.
If you are a child living in a home, you can be a leader there as well, especially if you have siblings. But there is that ripple effect of your leadership. And we have to think about positive and negative impacts of that. Let's dig into that in the next segment here, the negative impacts of bad leadership. Just thinking about that article that I referenced earlier, this trickle-down effect of good and bad leadership. There are some certain outcomes from bad leadership that you can just look at an organization and determine, probably bad leadership there. So here's some of the outcomes of bad leadership. First off, you've got unengaged and disconnected people who just are not working together. If you're looking at the team, there's a high turnover rate. So these are metrics that you can measure. You've got a high turnover rate. People just don't want to be there. And when you talk about a company that's selling products to customers, you're going to see dissatisfied customers. You're going to see diminishing sales. And overall, bad leadership outcomes result in a toxic culture for that organization. But how does this play out in real life? I hate to go back to military stories. These have been the most impactful on me, so I hope you'll bear with me on this. But just thinking about a negative impact of bad leadership, I had a new battalion commander that came in one time. I was an NCO in an infantry battalion. I was a sergeant, E5, so I'm down at the lower levels of leadership here. And we had a new battalion commander come to our unit. We came off deployment. Our old commander left, and a new lieutenant colonel took command for him. And this guy had low regard for the troops. I mean, he just looked at enlisted people with disdain. And when he was checking in at regimental headquarters, he was just bad mouthing our battalion. Oh, man, they can stand by. Those guys are all messed up. But what he didn't realize is that in the Marine Corps, there's this thing called the Lance Corporal Underground. The Lance Corporal Underground is kind of like a rumor mill, and they know what's going on everywhere. And so when this guy was up at regiment talking about our battalion, the Lance Corporal Underground, they opened up the communication lines, and the word got down to us. So you got a Lance Corporal sitting there in the office while this Lieutenant Colonel is spouting off about us. He picks up the phone and calls down to his buddies down in our battalion and said, hey, look, gave us a heads up. This guy's bad news. And his reputation turned out to be true. When we learned about him, he gets there and we started researching him. Turns out he was actually he was a lieutenant colonel, but he was an inexperienced staff officer. He had spent his career in D.C., up near the Pentagon, rather than commanding troops. He was a micromanager, and to the point where we ended up just calling him a battalion level squad leader, because he injected himself down into the minutia of individual squads in the battalion, just wearing himself out trying to run everything. The reason he was there is that he wanted to get promoted from 05 to 06 to become a full bird colonel, but he had to have a command billet to get that promotion. He was like, okay, cool. I'm going to get this ticket punched so I can get promotion. He kept his family in his house up in the DC area while he was down at Lejeune getting his checkbox. And he was in pursuit of greatness. Problem is he just didn't have the skills or ability or the experience. That was a huge negative impact on us. And the net result is there was just low morale in the entire battalion. I mean, we're all disenchanted because this new battalion commander replaced one that we loved. Our last guy was a good leader who loved us. He worked and trained us hard, but he did it out of love. And we knew that. And you can't fake that. And so getting this new guy, we just could tell he despised us. And then not only did he dislike us, but he embarked on a series of just very bad decisions. I mean, he was a staff officer, so that was his forte. He loved paperwork, and he just crushed the entire battalion with paperwork because that's what he knew. He wasn't there to learn from the sergeant major or any of the other experienced commanders. He just crushed us with what he knew. And then nightmare inspections. You'd typically have a battalion-wide inspection in preparation for making sure you're ready for whatever. Typically, the hard part of the inspection was when your team leader and squad leader came and looked at your stuff and said, okay, you need to clean this up, blah, 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 blah. Well, this battalion commander, this is why we say he was a squad leader. He would just jump into a platoon and start kicking people's stuff over and yelling at troops. And one time he was yelling at this kid because he had dirt on his headband. And we were like, sir, we are an actual infantry battalion, so those headbands are going to get dirty in the helmets. He wasn't hearing it. He also yelled at a kid in the motor pool, demanding to know how to check the oil. And the kid was so scared that he pointed to the dipstick for the transmission or something. It was wrong. But the funny thing is the colonel didn't know either. So he just yelled at the kid, and the kid pointed at the wrong thing, and the colonel didn't know it was the wrong thing. And so he just, oh, okay. So basically it just said, I just want to yell at you. That's my whole goal here. I'm not actually looking to get the right answer. It was just bad. He conducted nightmare inspections. And then here's the real bad thing that personally impacted me and the Marines in our platoon. He forced our platoon to erect this huge army tent when we went out to the field. And when I say army tent, we called it a GP tent. If you've ever seen that show MASH back in the day, it's these big, huge tents that they lived in. And so the colonel decided, hey, your platoon, because you're so large, you need to take one of these huge tents and put it up in the field. And so I literally told the guy, I said, hey, sir, we are training in maneuver warfare. That's our doctrine. If we put up this huge tent, we're not mobile at all. If we have to move at a moment's notice, and if we have to put this tent away, that's not cool. He forced us to. So we threw the tent in the back of a Humvee, and then we would just go to the field and not put it up. But he started coming out to our location, making us put the tent up. That's how, this was such micromanagement. So we ended up putting the tent up. If I've got a tent out in the field, and if I don't have to sleep under the dew falling on me and stuff like that, I'm going to sleep in it. So the troops were sleeping under this tent. Then a thunderstorm came, and you got all these Marines under this huge tent with all their rifles, all their mortar gear, all this metal that they're sleeping amongst. It's a huge magnet for lightning. As you can guess, the tent got struck by lightning. Mass casualty situation. We've got 19 Marines in the hospital. Very bad. People with neurological damage that impacted them the rest of their lives. Now, thankfully, no one was killed, but 19 Marines were in the hospital. And I had literally just gotten out of the Marine Corps when this happened. So I got a call from one of my friends, and they said, "You're not going to believe what happened." I was just incensed. I was still technically in the Marines, but I was on what they call terminal leave. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? And so there's this organization at the time, it was called Soldiers for the Truth. I don't know if they're still around, but it was led by a very famous Army colonel that was a war dog back in Vietnam. But I sent him an email and I just laid out all the stuff that this guy did, and culminating in this one event that put 19 Marines in the hospital. I literally got an email back from this guy and said, "Hey, can I put this in our newsletter? The Commandant of the Marine Corps reads this." And I said, "Sure." And he's like, "Hey, do you want me to change your name?" And I said, "No. If he ever reads this, I want him to know that it was one of his troops that reported it." And sure enough, my email got published as part of the newsletter. And you can't deny what I was saying, because the Commandant of the Marine Corps can just look at the incident reports and see, yeah, 19 Marines in the hospital. And now he gets information on why this happened. And it was just a bad verdict on this guy's leadership for our battalion. I ended up calling down to our company office that needed something. And they heard I was on the phone, and somebody grabbed the phone and said, "What did you do?" Come to find out, the Commandant read the letter and word went down. This is bad. So I think this guy, I don't know what happened to him, but I hear that he never got promoted to colonel. That was a little bit of satisfaction that, hey, you know what? This guy did not make it to colonel. He did not make it to the next level because of his bad behavior and just bad decisions. And then here's the bad part of that, though. Because of the bad leadership in our battalion, only a few of the non-commissioned officers in our company stayed in the military. Most of us left. We were like, no, we're not staying for this. Just terrible. So, yes, bad leadership, very bad outcomes.
Yeah. You know, it's a wound that festers. The decisions that bad leaders make and the effects they have on the folks around them, under them, it can create this cycle of just good people leaving, more inexperienced folks coming in, the work suffering, the morale is suffering, and it's not good.
Right. Now, if this colonel, just because he was a bad leader, if he just had the sense about himself enough to realize his limitations, he really could have leaned on his senior leadership and they could have taught him and helped him. He was bullheaded. He came in and he imposed this on an entire battalion of 1,000 Marines. And it caused a lot of problems throughout the organization. Now, this is the military. We can tell stories about the tech industry as well. One story, I'll just give you a quick rundown. I was part of an R&D organization that imploded. They just made bad decisions. First off, the company I was with, this was ages ago, and I'm not going to name any names, but the company decided to purchase a smaller company with an untested product. They purchased this company and then canceled the product that was actually successful. Within this organization, there was this toxic culture. The teams were very political. They worked against each other. The managers were fighting over, they were fighting over dumb stuff like who had the nicest office. Openly. They were openly fighting each other. And there was just this me first philosophy amongst almost everyone. It just prevailed, and the good people ended up peeling off. It just had very negative impact on customers. And we dealt with a lot of service providers with this job. And when we canceled that good product, we were talking to one of the customers and they said, "Listen, you canceled this product and we're never buying another product from your company." And they never did. Another customer that we worked with, they attended one of our product presentations and they were promised a bunch of things we couldn't deliver. And they ended up buying from us and it was a failure. So just very bad leadership. Bad leadership, it's just destructive by its nature. It's like a cancer that eats away at an organization's effectiveness. And being a member of these teams is demoralizing and disheartening. Right, James?
Yeah. One of the common themes here is sort of the underlying is the problematic leadership comes from folks that do not listen.
Right.
Folks that won't listen for input. It's frustrating too, those that seek it and still don't listen, right? They come and ask you, well, what do you think? So you tell them, I think this is what we should do. Your team comes together and says, yeah, we think this should be this sounds like a really good approach to us. And then leadership's like, okay. And then,
right. Yeah. I know better.
Yeah.
Disregard the input.
Or, this is not the way I want to do it. It's like, well.
Right. Oh, and that's so negative.
Once
you do that, your people are like, oh, they don't trust you now. And then you go about it and do it your own way. And if it fails, yeah, you've lost out with your people. They don't trust you. And then your turnover rate is going to start to increase, I would say.
Yeah.
So those are negative impacts of bad leadership. And we definitely want to stay on a positive trend. So let's talk about some positive impacts of good leadership. So what are some of the outcomes you can expect if you're working in an organization with good leadership? First off, you're going to have engaged, energized people. I mean, when you've got good leadership, whether it's people at the top or people that are operating within the organization that are good leaders, there's just a buzz in the place. People love it there. There's a low turnover rate because people want to actually be there and people want to join that team. And if you're selling a product, you're going to have happy customers. There's going to be growth in your sales. And overall, you're going to have a very positive culture that pursues excellence. So that's what happens when you have good leadership in an organization. So how does this play out in real life? Let me tell you a story about a man named Colonel David Hackworth. So just a quick intro on this man. He was an enlisted person. He enlisted in the Army right after World War II and served under some very good leaders in Italy who taught him what good leadership looks like. He ended up fighting in the Korean War. He was an infantry guy and fought in the Korean War, proved himself very capable as a fighter, and he ended up getting promoted to lieutenant as a combat promotion. That tells you you're a skilled soldier or Marine if you're getting promoted to an officer position in the middle of combat. That's what happened. Now, the caveat there is sometimes you just don't have anyone to lead a platoon, and so they just make you a lieutenant. That wasn't the case with David Hackworth. He was a hard dude. He was an awesome fighter. And his platoon mates, they started calling him Hack. So they took his last name and just said, hey, your name's Hack now. And after Korea, he ended up staying in the Army and made a career out of it. He had a habit of very close communication with the troops. And there's a story once of he ends up going to a company formation before sunrise. So it's dark outside. And so they can't tell who he is. He had taken off his rank and he pulled his hat down over his face and kind of stood there amongst the troops, and he joined their formation so he could listen to the chatter. And he got a feel for what was happening in his unit by doing that. He talked to the troops. He wanted input from them, and he actually cared about them. Now, he eventually became a battalion commander. He was a lieutenant colonel in Vietnam. He took command of an infantry battalion. And when he did that, I mean, this was his attitude. He's like, look, here are our limitations. We need to know how to fight in the jungle. And he started asking questions, and he realized that the Australians were good jungle fighters. He ended up hooking up with them, and he wanted to learn their craft. He wanted, how do you fight in the jungle? So he met with them and learned from them, and he wanted to take those lessons and implement them with his battalion. But Army leadership put the kibosh on it. They didn't want him to do that. So he snuck around and did it anyway. And he went against the grain, and he took those jungle fighting lessons from the Aussies and brought it back to his battalion, and he put it in place. He was like one of the very few Army units that were doing that. And then because he cared for the troops and because he believed in giving them the tools they need to survive, morale was just awesome in that unit. Now, any infantry unit in Vietnam, it had a lot of draftees. And this guy, Hackworth, he loved draftees because They were in the Army against their will in most cases. And if you're forced to be there and you're in that place where you might die from bad decisions, you're going to speak up. And that's what the draftees did. They didn't suffer fools. I mean, if you had a dumb lieutenant that was just trying to, hey, we need to do this and blah, 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 the draftees are going to be like, nope. Sit down, Lieutenant. We're not doing that because you're not getting us killed. They just didn't stand for bad leaders who got people hurt or killed. And they told the truth. And it was, Hackworth viewed that as a huge asset to him as a leader. And they responded to Hack's leadership, and they became very proficient at jungle warfare. When they deployed, that battalion suffered minimal casualties during the deployment. At the time, Army leadership, they looked at body counts and all this stuff, and that's kind of how they measured success. And the ratio of that battalion's casualties as compared to the enemy, it was good. And so that was a very successful deployment, and the troops loved Hack. But over time, Hack became disenchanted with Army leadership. He saw these glaring problems with how the war was being fought, and he spoke up about it. He loved his troops so much that he stood up to the brass, literally putting his career on the line. He loved the Army. He loved what he was doing, but he saw what was wrong in the Vietnam War and said, you know what? This isn't right. And he stood up to the brass. Now, eventually he gave an interview to ABC News, and I'll try to link that in this episode. It's on YouTube. But he gave an interview to ABC News criticizing Army leaders. And in that interview, he's like, look, these leaders are selfish. They're greedy. They're not concerned with the welfare of the unit. They're not technically proficient. They're incompetent. Those were some of the things he said about Army leadership. That was the death knell for his career. And they went after him after this. In his mind, that was the right thing to do. His troops benefited from his good leadership. Now, Hack would eventually, he left the Army after this. He retired, and he eventually wrote an autobiography called About Face. And it was actually on our battalion's reading list when I was in the military. And when we were deployed, I picked up this book and read it. It really opened my eyes, and I benefited from David Hackworth's story.
That's cool. That is a huge shot in the arm when your leaders stand up for you. I've been very fortunate throughout my career to have many good leaders, bosses that were also leaders. And that is one of the number one things is standing up for your team, whether it's just, in some cases, it's just taking the flag so that the team doesn't have to deal with it.
Right.
You know, so what? Somebody on the team made a mistake. You tell them about their mistake, and the boss deals with the fallout because it's kind of his job.
Yeah.
In my mind, it's like if you're the leader, it's kind of on you to deal with it. And he dealt with it, tells the team member what they did wrong, and goes off and does whatever he needs to do to make it okay with other people.
Right.
But he doesn't let the other people come down on the team members.
Yeah.
Right. That's not okay.
Yeah.
And so that's huge and inspiring to work with someone who's willing to stand up for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you got a toxic team, there's blame storming, and people, when something bad happens and you got just a toxic culture, people are looking to blame someone, throw them under the bus and find someone to get them in trouble. And it's like, ew, you don't want that.
Nope.
And I'm thankful that I was fortunate to work for good leaders who allowed me to fail. And I heard one commander call it this. He's like, hey, we want to fail forward. Yeah, you made a mistake, but hey, look, this is what you need to do to correct it and move on. And I'm thankful for that. I mean, when I was a young Marine, I can't tell you how many times I heard my commanders and staff NCOs pull me to the side and say things like, hey, that was good initiative, but bad judgment. And say, look, yeah, don't do that. And I was making huge mistakes, and they taught me. And that was super important for me. And I'm thankful for that. So
yeah, I've had those experiences where I come out of a meeting one time and the boss is like, yeah, he's like, I'll stand behind you and stand with you, but Yeah, that was stupid. Don't say that again. Yeah, don't do that again.
Right.
And that was another good one too. Was where I screwed up. The boss came down. He's like, just don't do that again.
That's hilarious.
Yes, sir. Don't do that again. I mean, it's like I knew I screwed up. He knew I screwed up. It's like, just, okay, we're going to learn from it. Don't do it again.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, Jocko Willink has an entire podcast, the Jocko Willink, or the Jocko podcast, and he talks about taking ownership and just that culture of not trying to blame others for when bad things happen. You take responsibility and just go, you know what? You do an after action report. This is common in the military. You do an after action where you sit down and talk about the mistakes that took place. And if you got a good culture, you can sit down and have those conversations and say, you know, this is what we did wrong, and this is what we need to improve. And it's all with the idea that, hey, we're trying to make ourselves better rather than we're going to find the culprit and punish them and run them out of town. That's the difference between good culture and bad culture. So, I mean, yeah, just good leadership. It's like compound interest applied to people. You know, good leadership just has a huge multiplier effect that pays dividends with individuals and also the larger team. That's just a good thing. So again, share your stories with us. If you're listening to this, share some good, some bad, some funny, and we'd love to hear from you. Here's a funny leadership story just to keep things positive. When I was in boot camp, I was in the chow hall, and another drill instructor from a different platoon saw me. He didn't like something I was doing, and he comes up and he starts poking me in the chest and yelling at me. And he was this little short fella. So I'm standing at attention. He's poking me. Arr! My drill instructor sees it, and he's like, I'm not going to have this. And so he walks up to me and this other drill instructor. And by the way, we were called privates. I was in 2nd Battalion at Parris Island in boot camp. And at that time, we referred to each other as privates. And so my drill instructor comes over and he starts going, hey, drill instructor. He's trying to politely get the guy to stop poking me in the chest and yelling at me because that's not cool. You don't put your hands on a recruit. And so he keeps trying to get the guy's attention. The guy's not listening. He's just yelling at me and poking me. And finally, my drill instructor yells at the other guy and goes, drill instructor, get your hands off my private. The place just stopped and you could hear a pin drop. And the two drill instructors just kind of looked at each other and they were about to start laughing and they just walked away from each other. So funny leadership story. If you got one, please share it with us. Let's circle back. And we've just finished the series on Genghis Khan and his leadership. And let's talk about the character of Genghis Khan's leadership. First off, now this is typically not in leadership books, but the first thing that characterized Genghis Khan's leadership was love. His concern for others motivated him, and it drove how they conducted their military campaigns and everything. He loved his people. He acted in a way to protect them so that they were not injured unnecessarily. So he loved them. And you think about his love for his wife and how that drove him to lead an assault to rescue her when she was captured. He loved her. He wanted her back. And that also extended to his people. When the chips were down, he looked around him and reached out to his people and bonded with them and said, look, let's work together. There's just covenants that they made with one another based on their love for one another, mutual love and respect. So that was the first, and I would say the most important character of his leadership. And you can't fake that. And when I look back on good leaders I've had in the past, I see that ingredient of love. They cared enough about me to say, hey, look, here's what you need to correct. That's love. Now, love isn't just, good feelings. It's like, if I love you enough if I'm leading, I'm going to point out the issues and I'm going to help you improve. I'm also going to do things that aren't so fun for the benefit of you and the entire organization. If I love you and I'm your leader. And another characteristic of Genghis Khan's leadership was humility. He literally had a very sober assessment of his own skills and abilities. He didn't think too highly of himself. And you think back on when he died and the letter he wrote talking about his leadership, he was like, well, okay, I was successful, but it was usually because the other people were just making mistakes or something like that. So he was just very humble, and he didn't think too highly of himself. And then he regarded his people as his equals. He talked about them like, hey, we eat the same food. We're riding the same horses. We're equal. So that was his humility. And another character of his leadership was that he built trust amongst his people. This kind of coincides with his love, but he actively and proactively built trust with his people. And he had very close relationships with the people that he led. And you don't have that by accident. It doesn't just happen. You have to proactively take steps to form bonds with the people around you. So he built trust. And then you get into his proficiency, right? I mean, you can love people, you can be humble, and you can build trust with them. But if you're not proficient at what you're doing, it just wrecks everything, right? So he was proficient. He was an intellectual first and foremost. He was a student and teacher of warfare. He gave himself over to learning that trade, that craft, and he taught others. And he implemented it on a huge scale with a 100,000 troop army. That's what he did as an intellectual. He was also adaptable. In the life of Genghis Khan, there are numerous stories about where he conquers an area, but then he learns from their culture and he adapts their means and methods into how he conducts his business. So he was adaptable. He was just generally open to learning new things. So he was an intellectual. Also, as far as his proficiency goes, he believed in decentralized command. So he wanted to give authority and responsibility down at the lowest levels so that even the lowest ranked person in the unit can make a decision on how to proceed with a particular matter. So he believed in decentralized command. He was also a very good communicator. There's that story about Genghis Khan and how they passed orders. The whole army was pretty much illiterate. And so the way they passed orders back and forth was singing them to each other in very well-known songs that they knew. So they would sing the orders to one another to prevent that issue with the game of telephone where, word gets passed and it changes between every iteration of telling it. But if you put it to a rhyme or a song that that's how they were able to make sure that the orders passed were accurate. So he was a skilled communicator. He was also a very skilled planner. And we saw that in the story about how they planned for the Churchhead campaign. And they sat down as basically a nation and decided on whether to go to war. And then they went through a very deliberative process to plan out their war plans for going to war. And he was also a decisive leader. So he took decisive action at the proper times to ensure success. Those are the things that gets into his proficiency. So he loved people, he was humble, he built trust, and he was proficient at what he did. And then the results that came out of that were he had a very loyal group of followers. The nation loved him. He never had generals that deserted. He never had to punish generals for infractions because they were just loyal and they wanted to do a good job. And then you see the results also in his successful military conquests against much larger armies. So that's a direct result of his leadership. And then finally we can see that he had an empire that endured for a long time. That's some of the character of his leadership, but this is controversial. Let me ask this question. Is it true that people are born leaders? And my answer to that is no. If you disagree with that, please share. Love to hear from you on it. But if you look at the leadership ability, the characteristics of Genghis Khan's leadership, it's evident that he had to learn these skills. You're not born knowing these things. And he wasn't born with all of these. And that's actually the view of Marine Corps leadership doctrine. The idea is that leaders are built, they're trained. And, you may have individual gifts that lend you toward becoming a good leader, but you still have to be taught to be a leader. It's not ingrained. You're not just born with the ability to be a good leader. What are your thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, I agree. I think there may be some people that may have some, we all have better skills and abilities and things, but in most cases, even if you have some better leadership ability, there's a whole lot of other skills and things that need to be built upon for you to become a great leader.
Yeah.
And learning those things really needs to be at the top of kind of everyone's list.
Right.
As we've said earlier, any position you have can be a leader, even if you're at the bottom.
Right.
But if you are indeed going to be responsible for others, I really think it is incumbent upon you to take the time to learn how to be a good leader.
I agree.
Go make the effort to learn. And one of the key things about good leaders is they want to learn. They want to learn. They want to listen to their team.
Right.
Listen to the people around them. Learning how to be a good leader. What does that look like?
Yep.
Yeah.
And good leaders, they don't go around telling you they're good leaders. That's why it's funny. I see people's LinkedIn profiles and they're like, I'm a thought leader or I'm a leader, and it's like, okay, I'm sorry. I don't want to bag on people. These are good people. I'm not trying to bag on people, but I'm telling you, one of the best things that I took away from the military was I learned that I'm not a good leader. I mean, from the outset, I get put into a position of leadership as a kid, and you think that it's because there's something special about you, and wow, I was selected for this, blah, 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 and there is something special. And so you think you're different than other people and you have special skills and abilities. I found out that just wasn't true. So, and I had good leaders that called me out and said, you know what? That's wrong. You can't do that. And they corrected me. And then it takes years to pick that up, to learn how to be a good leader. And you can't just go sit through a class and say, this is good leadership. You can't just read a document because you don't know your blind spots. You don't know what you don't know. And you need others to sit down with you and go, hey, look, let's look at this. You do an after action on something that just went down, and you say, okay, cool. All right, so the smoke settled, the dust has settled here. Here's what happened. Here's what I recommend you do in the future if you run into this situation again, and you learn. And that is training. That's the difference between education and training. The difference between just learning information versus applying it and then seeing where you fall short and then going, you know what? Okay, I need to get better at this. And then over time, you make improvements and you get better at it. And so you'll never hear me say, I'm a good leader, because I'm not. I've got some skills and ability, but I have to look at myself and realize I've got limitations. So anyways.
Just one last thing. It struck me as I was listening to you talk, as leaders interact with people, everybody's different. And there can be some people that a leader can, a particular manager or director can come and sit down with, and they things just click, right? But there's other people that doesn't happen for.
Right.
And as a leader wanting to learn, you need to be aware of that.
Yes.
You need to pick up on that and then examine yourself. And maybe your examination means, oh, well, I need to encourage that person to talk more or something. But it's like, there's a feedback system that kind of needs to be in place for leaders to grow.
Yeah.
You're dealing with people, just like if you're dealing with the public in this, if you've ever been in the service industry, whether you've been serving burgers or anything else, it's like you're got all kinds of people, and you need to learn how to interact with all those different types of folks.
I agree. And if you're a parent, you know this. If you have more than one child, you know that they're totally different individuals. And what motivates one does not motivate the other. I've got a son and a daughter. They're vastly different human beings. And what motivates my daughter is totally different than what motivates my son. If you're a parent, you're a leader, whether you like it or not. And so it's incumbent that we learn and try to grow in this area. Now, I look back on my parenting and I go, oh my word, I wish I'd known this before so that I could have done it differently. So lots of mistakes along the way, but, and I've talked to my kids about it and said, you know what, here's where I fell short. And you got to be humble about it, but we're all leaders. So let's just some closing thoughts here. leadership is not limited to people in a specific role with fancy titles. And we all should learn to be a leader. At a minimum, you're leading yourself and you want to improve your life. It takes leadership skills to do that. In a group setting, you have influence over others, whether you know it or not. And we need to learn how to do this in a way where we're influencing others to create positive outcomes. Think about that as a leader. In the next episode, we're actually embarking on a series of episodes on this topic. We're calling it leadership, but we're going to touch on a lot of different things here. And so we'd love to hear your leadership stories. Again, good, bad, funny, whatever. Please feel free to share those with us, either at feedback@clutteredpath.com or just look in this episode and you can see ways to contact us. So please reach out. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you, folks, for joining us.
And then we are on a ticking uneasy night. This is the Cluttered Path. Stories about life.